Hey guys, Baron here. Today we're finally back with a new video. It's been a while, and we've been on sort of hiatus on this channel throughout the summer. But starting this autumn, I really want to get back into things and want to start making content again. And we're gonna have a start of that today. We're gonna make another anime review of an anime I watched over the summer and that I thought of for a long time watching, but now finally get around to it and just experience how much of a masterpiece it is. And that masterpiece is Death Note. So today we're gonna review that, and I'm gonna share my opinions of this great anime with you guys. So if you're hyped about this video and want to show your support about this channel in general, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the subscribe button, and share this video with a friend or two. But with that being said, let's finally get into it. Death Note is a psychological thriller originally being created by Tsugumi Ohba and Takeshi Obata, being the author and illustrator to the original manga, and the original manga was eventually adapted into an anime series. And it follows a high school student Light Yagami. Now, Light is a high school student in Japan who studies law and is at the top of his class, but he still feels like he is living an unfulfilled life and is not really contributing to society. But one day, he finds a notebook dropping out of the sky. He picks it up, and that is the Death Note that he just found, with unlimited power to basically kill off anyone he writes in a note in any fashion he views suitable, as long as it's physically possible. And with this note, he starts a killing spree going by the name of Kira, and eventually works his way into killing more and more criminals in Japan. And it's eventually being pursued by the master detective, L. And that is where our story starts, with a cat and mouse chase between Light Yagami and L. And those two characters really developing in their own rights. And as Light continues to killing criminals, L gets more and more on his case and gets closer and closer to catching him. And that's really where our intrigue in the story lies. The thought about Light maybe getting away with it and maybe not getting away with it. Because he is essentially the character we follow, a protagonist, but he is also a villain. And that's something else that is very interesting about the anime show in general. The moral complexity. Now, the interesting thing about the story is that it really is a chase, a cat and mouse chase between L and Light. But the interesting thing is that you don't know who's cat and who's mouse. L wants to find Light because he's essentially a criminal and has to be put under justice. But Light also wants to find and kill L and find out his true identity so he can write his name in a notebook to basically eliminate any obstacle that he would have. And his biggest obstacle is, of course, L. Now, the interesting thing about the story is that it really is a chase, a cat and mouse chase between L and Light. But the interesting thing is that you don't know who's cat and who's mouse. L wants to find Light because he's essentially a criminal and has to be put under justice. But Light also wants to find and kill L and find out his true identity so he can write his name in a notebook to basically eliminate any obstacle that he would have. And his biggest obstacle is, of course, L. And with both of these characters being extremely intelligent, it really allows for some really interesting intrigue and a good conflict between them, which makes you interested enough to keep on watching throughout the whole series. Now, the show has an interesting way of dealing with its psychological aspects, because it really goes into the deepest minds and mindsets of the character. Now, the show is psychological and intertwines its psychological aspects in a fun way, and that is through morally complex characters. They are not either good or bad, they are really both. And with Light and L essentially being two sides of the same coin, they are both good and bad. Light does a lot of things that are horrible. I mean, he kills people, for God's sakes. He kills people by the thousands. But he does it for his own sense of justice. And the same really goes for L. He does things for the name of justice and for the sake of being fair to everyone. And that criminals should essentially be captured. But he does that in very questionable ways, for example, capturing and torturing people just to get information. And that is definitely something that you can question throughout the show. And it really shows that no character is good or bad entirely. They all have their own perspectives and sides to each side of the coin, and it really is interesting, and that really shows well-developed character, really, because you see the moral ambiguity of every single character, and that really is an interesting aspect. And that is where the show poses an interesting question. What is justice? It really is an undefined and hard to define concept in this show, because essentially both Light and L do things out of their own sense of justice, like I mentioned, but in the end, none of them are justice as we would define it, maybe. And that is a really interesting concept. And for example, Light does things because he thinks it is justice for criminals to answer to crimes and for essentially to be killed and prosecuted. But he knows that it is not entirely morally clean, but he does it anyway because he thinks it is the right thing and the thing that is necessary to do. So the show really poses a dilemma to what is necessary in your own opinion and what is essentially the main core of justice. And it is hard to define, really, but it is an interesting question that show poses, and it really makes for some deep thinking for a viewer in the show. And that is something I really enjoy, when the show makes you pose questions and makes you think. And Death Note definitely does a really good job of that, because it makes you think of what is right and what is wrong. Light is the protagonist, yet antagonist. He is a hero and a villain at the same time. He is the hero of his own story, but the villain of so many other stories. And that essentially means that from either perspective you can be both a good and bad, and there is essentially no right or wrong. It is only a matter of perspective. Now, beyond the psychological thriller aspect, Death Note is actually a really dark fantasy too, because it allows for some supernatural elements to be blended in. For example, we follow gods of death being called Shinigami, who essentially are the owners of the notebook and decide the rules for the manipulators of these notebooks. And essentially, Light, for example, meets the Shinigami Ryuk, who is sort of his... he thinks of him as a sidekick, really, throughout the whole series. But as you realize, Ryuk has got a plan of his own, and it really is the puppeteer master behind the whole thing. And that really comes full closure in the end. I won't spoil that, but it really is interesting how Ryuk is really the manipulator behind the whole thing. And it's something you forget kind of throughout the series, but it really is an interesting intrigue to it all. Now you might think, since Light essentially writes down a lot of criminals' names in his notebook and essentially kills them through so many brutal fashions, that the show would be really, really violent and would show a lot of gruesome deaths. But it actually doesn't, and that's a really interesting aspect to the show, because instead it opts for developing thrilling plotlines and intelligent stories other than just being a brutal carcass of a show. And that really allows for the psychological thriller aspect to be developed thoroughly, and it really is the main core of the show. And I feel like that is definitely the right choice of what they should have done with the show. It could have been a brutal mess, but instead they went for something intelligent and something that is essentially thrilling and challenging to the audience. And with so much of the anime community and also of the general media sort of film industry being essentially violence, it is refreshing to see a show about violence that is not essentially what you would call violent. Now, the show has a nice narrative structure from beginning to end. You feel like everything progresses in a nice way, and everything sort of is allowed to be fleshed out in the show, which is a good thing. And in a lot of shows, that isn't allowed. And I mean, the show is only about 30 episodes long, but it is thoroughly developed through one simple measure. I think that is because the show is divided into two parts, with having a definitive point where the show is divided. And that really allows for the narrative time in the show to be thoroughly structured and to be thoroughly fleshed out, so you actually get to follow the characters throughout many years and get to follow how they get from the beginning to end in a very thorough manner, even though it is only 30 episodes, so you can only see that much. And with different characters being introduced in different parts, you never feel like the show is inconsistent, and you never feel like it is unproperly handled. And you definitely feel like it is a sequel, the second part is a sequel to the first part. And you should think of them as two different things, really, because, I mean, they follow some of the main characters, and some of the main characters all are part of the show all throughout. But the two parts really have different feelings to them, and really does have different tones and sort of motives, really. And that is definitely an interesting concept, and it allows for the Death Note show to feel, like I said, properly developed and properly spread out, so to say. And that is, I feel like, because the show isn't constricted by a narrative time. It really allows you to follow the characters throughout many years and follow the entire intrigue from beginning to end. And it is because of the characters and them being so morally complex that it makes them super interesting. Overall, because of its brilliance and its ability to challenge the audience in interesting ways, I'm gonna give Death Note an A. It is not perfect, but it is one of the best shows that the anime community has ever gotten, and one of the best psychological thrillers I've seen in a long time. So guys, that is our review of Death Note. What do you think? Have you seen this anime? Are you gonna watch it? What do you think of it? Let us know in the comment section below. I would love to hear your thoughts and to get a discussion going. Also, of course, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, that subscribe button, and share this video with a friend or two. With that being said, I'm gonna get the hashtag out of here. Thank you guys for checking out the video. Before, until, and after seeing you next time though, stay awesome.